Before the pyramids pierced the desert sky, before the first pharaoh claimed dominion over the land of two kingdoms, before hieroglyphs told their stories on temple walls, there existed only the river and the endless expanse of untamed wilderness that stretched beyond memory. In those primordial times, when the world was young and the boundaries between earth and sky seemed more fluid than they would ever be again, a great waterway carved its patient path through a landscape that knew neither human footprint nor the geometry of cultivation. The Nile moved then, as it had for countless millennia, a serpentine ribbon of life threading through terrain that bore no resemblance to the ordered civilization that would one day flourish along its banks. This was Egypt before Egypt existed, a realm where the river followed channels that time and human hands would later alter, where its waters spread and receded according to rhythms older than recorded history. The great stream flowed northward through territories that remained unmapped in human consciousness, carrying within its depths the sediments that would eventually build a nation, bearing the promise of fertility through landscapes that waited in patient silence for transformation. Along the river's ancient course, papyrus marshes stretched for miles in directions that the eye could not encompass, their green stems rising from dark waters like a vast natural cathedral. These wetlands teemed with life forms that moved according to instincts unmarked by human observation. Crocodiles glided through channels where their descendants would later become sacred symbols, their movements creating barely perceptible ripples across surfaces that reflected nothing but sky and vegetation. Hippopotami wallowed in shallows that would someday witness the passage of royal barges, their massive forms displacing water that carried no human cargo, no offerings to distant gods, no tribute from conquered lands. The riverbanks themselves told stories written in layers of silt and stone, each stratum marking seasons of flood and drought that preceded human memory. Wild grasses grew in thick abundance where ceremonial temples would later rise, their roots drinking deeply from soil that held within its composition the future of agriculture, the foundation of cities, the very substance from which an empire would grow. These grasslands swayed in winds that carried no sounds of human activity, no chanting of priests, no commands of overseers, no lullabies sung to royal children. Only the whisper of vegetation and the distant calls of creatures who claimed this territory as their undisputed domain. Above the marshlands and grasslands, the desert pressed close to the river's edge in many places, creating a landscape of dramatic contrasts that would later become central to Egyptian cosmology and religious thought. Sand dunes shifted and reformed according to wind patterns that had blown unchanged for geological ages, their curves and ridges creating natural sculptures that stood as monuments to time itself. Between the green abundance of the riverine zone and the austere beauty of the desert lay transition areas where hardy shrubs and scattered palms found purchase in soil that balanced between fertility and aridity, creating microenvironments that supported their own unique communities of life. The great river's flood cycles in these ancient times followed patterns established long before human observation began to mark their rhythm and significance. Each year, waters would rise and spread across the land with a generosity that seemed almost conscious in its timing and extent. The flooding waters carried with them the rich, dark soil that had been gathered from distant highlands, soil that would settle across the landscape like a gift renewed with each cycle. As the waters receded, they left behind not the ordered field systems that would later characterize Egyptian agriculture, but vast expanses of naturally fertilized earth where wild plants flourished in spectacular abundance. Fish moved through these seasonal floodplains in great schools, their silver forms creating living patterns beneath waters that reflected clouds drifting across skies unmarked by human architectural achievements. Waterfowl descended in enormous flocks during migration seasons, their wings darkening the sky as they settled on lakes and marshes that existed in pristine abundance. The sound of their calls created symphonies that echoed across landscapes empty of human settlement, their music rising and falling with the natural cadences that would later inspire the rhythm of Egyptian poetry and song. In the deeper channels where the river ran strongest, Ancient fish species pursued their seasonal journeys up and down the waterway, following routes that connected distant regions in a network of natural highways. These aquatic travelers carried within their movements the geographic unity that would later become politically significant, demonstrating through their migrations that the river created connections across vast distances, binding together territories that might otherwise have remained isolated and distinct. The vegetation along the river's course grew in wild profusion, creating natural gardens of extraordinary diversity and beauty. Trees that would later be considered sacred flourished in groves where their branches intertwined freely, creating canopies that filtered sunlight into patterns of green and gold. Flowering vines created cascades of color that changed with the seasons, their blooms attracting insects and birds whose interactions would inspire future artistic motifs and religious symbolism. The air itself seemed to shimmer with the abundance of life, carrying scents of water and growing things that would forever after be associated with the essence of Egyptian landscape. Along the higher ground that bordered the floodplains, rocky outcroppings provided glimpses of the geological foundations that underlay this fertile surface world. These exposed stones held within their crystalline structures the minerals and building materials that would someday be quarried for temples and monuments, their surfaces already bearing the natural patterns and colors that would captivate future sculptors and architects. The interplay between the living river system and these eternal stone formations created a landscape where the forces of growth and preservation existed in perfect balance. Wildlife corridors followed the river's meandering path, connecting ecosystems across hundreds of miles and creating pathways for the seasonal movements of countless species. Lions moved through territories that would later echo with human voices, their presence marking the landscape with an authority that required no monuments or written proclamations. Antelope gathered at watering places where their hoofprints pressed into mud that would dry and crumble and be renewed with each flood cycle, leaving no permanent record of their passage, yet contributing to the eternal cycle of life along the great river. The night sky above this primordial landscape blazed with stars, whose patterns would later be incorporated into Egyptian religious and architectural traditions. Without the light of human settlements to dim their radiance, these celestial bodies appeared with a clarity and brilliance that seemed to bring the heavens close to earth. The river reflected their light in long silver paths that stretched across its dark surface, creating a connection between the terrestrial waterway and the cosmic river that flowed across the sky, establishing visual metaphors that would resonate through millennia of Egyptian thought and artistic expression. This was the stage upon which human civilization would eventually make its entrance, a landscape already perfect in its natural organization, already demonstrating the principles of renewal and abundance that would become central to Egyptian culture and religion. The river flowed through this wilderness, carrying within its current not just water and sediment, but the very possibility of the future, the potential for transformation that would eventually reshape this wild paradise into one of humanity's greatest civilizations. The ancient river continued its eternal dance through seasons uncounted, carrying within its waters the promise of abundance that would eventually transform wandering souls into builders of monuments. Along the endless banks of this primordial waterway, small bands of hunter-gatherers moved through landscapes that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the great current itself. These early peoples, emerging from the vast expanses of what would one day be known as the Sahara, followed pathways worn smooth by countless generations of feet, their eyes always drawn toward the gleaming thread of water that cut through the harsh terrain like a blade of silver light. The first encounters between human consciousness and the Nile's mysteries unfolded across millennia of patient observation. Generation after generation of these nomadic peoples returned to the river's edge, drawn by an understanding that lived deeper than thought, embedded in the very marrow of survival. They came seeking water during the scorching months when the desert winds carried nothing but dust and dreams of moisture. They came following the great herds of antelope and wild cattle that congregated along the fertile margins where grass grew thick and green. Most importantly, they came to witness the river's greatest secret, a phenomenon so extraordinary that it would eventually reshape the entire trajectory of human civilization. The annual flood arrived with the subtlety of dawn, beginning as a barely perceptible change in the water's color and scent. These keen observers, whose lives depended upon reading the smallest signals in their environment, noticed first the way the river's voice deepened from its usual murmur to something richer, more resonant. The current began to carry unfamiliar debris, fragments of vegetation from distant highlands they could only imagine, strange seeds and leaves that spoke of rainfall in far-off mountains, whose peaks touched clouds they had never seen. The water itself transformed from the clear blue-green of the dry season to something darker, pregnant with the fertile soil of 1,000 valleys. As the flood season progressed, these early river watchers witnessed transformations that must have seemed nothing short of miraculous. The Nile began to spread beyond its normal boundaries, creeping across the flat expanses of land with deliberate purpose. What had been bone-dry earth became first muddy channels, then shallow lakes that reflected the burning sky. Fish appeared as if summoned from the depths, silver bodies flashing in the newly formed pools. Waterbirds arrived in great clouds, their calls echoing across the temporary marshlands that bloomed with startling suddenness. The hunter-gatherer bands adapted their seasonal movements to match this rhythm of flood and recession, developing an intimate calendar written not in symbols, but in the language of observation and memory. They learned to read the river's moods in the changing patterns of bird migration, in the behavior of hippopotamuses that wallowed in the deeper channels, in the very quality of light reflected from the water's surface. Each subtle shift became a chapter in an encyclopedia of survival knowledge passed down through oral tradition, refined and expanded by each generation's careful attention to detail. During the peak of the flood season, when the Nile spread across vast floodplains like an inland sea, these early peoples discovered hunting and fishing opportunities that transformed their understanding of abundance. The temporary lakes teemed with fish trapped by the receding waters, easily caught in shallow pools or netted from makeshift rafts constructed from papyrus reeds. Wild fowl nested in the thick marshes that appeared overnight, their eggs and meat providing protein-rich supplements to diets otherwise dependent on the uncertain pursuit of desert game. The recession of the flood revealed perhaps the most transformative discovery of all. As the waters slowly retreated to the river's normal channel, they left behind a dark, rich silt that seemed to possess magical properties. Plants sprouted from this deposited earth with startling vigor, creating spontaneous gardens that required no human intervention. Wild grasses grew thick and tall, their seeds providing nourishment for both the people and the animals they hunted. Edible plants flourished in soil so fertile that it seemed to give birth to life itself. These observant peoples began to recognize patterns within patterns, understanding that the timing and extent of each flood varied according to subtle environmental cues. They noticed that certain celestial events coincided with the river's rising, that the appearance of specific stars on the horizon heralded the beginning of the flood season. The brightest star in the dawn sky, which would later be known as Sirius, became their herald of renewal. Its heliacal rising marking the moment when the life-giving waters would begin their inevitable expansion across the waiting land. Gradually, inevitably, some of these hunter-gatherer groups began to linger longer at favorable spots along the riverbank. Places where the annual flood created particularly rich soil deposits became seasonal camps, then semi-permanent settlements. The abundance provided by the river's cyclical generosity allowed for new forms of social organization, freeing some members of the group from the constant search for food to pursue other activities. Crafts developed, tools became more sophisticated, and the first tentative experiments in cultivation began as observant individuals learned to work with the river's natural rhythms rather than simply benefiting from their accidents. The relationship between human community and the great river deepened across countless generations, evolving from simple dependence to something approaching partnership. These early Nile peoples developed sophisticated techniques for predicting flood patterns, creating mental maps of how high waters might reach in different years and seasons. They learned to construct temporary shelters that could withstand the annual inundation, and to store surplus food during abundant times against the possibility of leaner seasons. Women gathered seeds from the wild plants that thrived in the flood-deposited silt, beginning to understand which varieties grew most successfully in different types of soil. Men tracked the movements of fish and waterfowl with increasing precision, developing specialized tools and techniques for harvesting the river's aquatic bounty. Children learned to read the subtle signs that preceded each phase of the flood cycle, their young eyes trained to notice changes in water level, current speed, and the behavior of riverside wildlife. The cultural implications of this deepening relationship with the Nile's rhythms extended far beyond mere survival strategies. Creation stories began to emerge that placed the great river at the center of existence. Mythologies that recognized the fundamental role of the annual flood in maintaining the delicate balance between life and death in this harsh landscape. Ritual practices developed around the timing of the flood's arrival and recession. Ceremonies that honored the mysterious forces that brought fertility to the land and abundance to the people. As centuries flowed past like the river itself, these hunter-gatherer societies accumulated a treasure trove of environmental knowledge that would eventually become the foundation for one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Their patient observation of the Nile's seasonal patterns, their growing understanding of how to work with rather than against the river's natural rhythms, and their development of social structures capable of managing abundance, created the essential preconditions for the emergence of agricultural settlements that would transform the entire region from a harsh wilderness into the verdant cradle of Egyptian civilization. As these early hunter-gatherers began to understand the river's ancient rhythm, something profound began to shift in the very fabric of human existence along the Nile's banks. The knowledge of when the waters would rise and when they would recede became more than mere observation. It became the foundation upon which an entirely new way of life would slowly, almost imperceptibly, take root. Where once scattered bands had followed the herds across vast stretches of increasingly arid landscape, now small groups began to linger longer in the fertile corridor that hugged the great river's edge. The transformation was not sudden, but rather unfolded like the river's own patient seasonal cycles, measured not in days or months, but in generations of accumulated wisdom and gradual change. Families who had once packed their few possessions and moved with the turning of seasons began to notice that certain bends in the river offered particular advantages: natural harbors where the current slowed, elevated banks that remained dry even during the highest floods, or stretches where wild grains grew with unusual abundance in the rich alluvial soil left behind by retreating waters. At first, these advantages merely influenced the timing and duration of temporary camps. A band might choose to remain through an entire flood cycle rather than moving on, constructing more substantial shelters from the reeds and mud that the river provided in endless supply. These early dwellings, simple frameworks of bundled papyrus stems, plastered with Nile mud and dried by the relentless sun, marked humanity's first tentative steps toward permanence in this ancient landscape. The very materials spoke of the river's generosity, everything needed for shelter growing from its banks or deposited by its floods. As seasons passed into years and years accumulated into decades, the boundaries between temporary occupation and permanent settlement began to blur, like morning mist rising from the river's surface. Children born in these semi-permanent camps grew up with an intimate knowledge of specific stretches of riverbank, learning not just the general patterns of flood and harvest that their parents had discovered, but the particular quirks and characteristics of individual locations. They knew which sandbanks would emerge first as the waters receded, which backwaters would harbour the fattest fish, and which patches of earth would sprout the densest stands of wild emmer wheat. This deepening familiarity with place coincided with the gradual recognition that the wild plants the Nile's floods nurtured could be encouraged and improved through human intervention. The transition from gathering wild seeds to deliberately planting and tending crops was so gradual that no single generation could have marked its beginning or end. Perhaps it began when someone noticed that seeds scattered near refuse pits grew with particular vigor, or when floods deposited soil in patterns that seemed to invite the careful placement of gathered grain. The cultivation of emmer wheat and barley, grains that had evolved alongside the Nile's floods for countless millennia, required a fundamental shift in human organization and temporal thinking. Unlike the immediate rewards of hunting and gathering, agriculture demanded patience, planning, and above all, the willingness to remain in one place long enough to nurture seeds through their entire growing cycle. This commitment to place transformed nomadic bands into settled communities with an investment in specific patches of earth that extended far beyond the present season. The rhythm of agricultural life began to synchronize with the river's ancient pulse in ways that hunting and gathering never could. The flood season became not just a time of retreat to higher ground, but a period of preparation and planning for the planting that would follow. As the waters receded and left behind their fertile gift of silt, families worked together to break the sun-baked earth, scatter precious seeds, and tend the growing crops through the months of drought that would follow until the next flood brought renewal. These early farming communities developed along the riverbank, like a string of emerald beads against the desert's golden backdrop, each settlement positioned to take advantage of the particular characteristics of its stretch of river. Some locations offered naturally occurring basins that captured and held floodwater longer than others, creating natural irrigation systems that required only minor human modification to become highly productive agricultural zones. Other settlements grew around elevated areas that provided refuge during high floods, while remaining close enough to fertile bottomland for efficient farming. The storage of surplus grain from successful harvests necessitated new technologies and social arrangements that further bound these communities to their chosen locations. Underground granaries lined with stones and sealed with Nile mud protected precious seed stores from both moisture and rodents, representing not just technological advancement, but a profound psychological commitment to remaining in one place. These stores of grain constituted the first true wealth that could not be easily carried, creating powerful incentives for permanent settlement and community defense. As agricultural success led to population growth, individual families found themselves part of larger social networks that extended beyond blood relationships to encompass entire settlements. The coordination required for communal irrigation projects, the organization of labor for harvest seasons, and the distribution of water rights during drought years created complex social structures that had never existed among nomadic bands. Village elders emerged, whose authority rested not on hunting prowess or shamanistic powers, but on their deep knowledge of agricultural cycles and their skill in managing the intricate social negotiations required for communal farming. The development of pottery technology, driven by the need to store both grain and water, marked another crucial step in the transition from nomadic to sedentary life. The fragile nature of ceramic vessels made them impractical for nomadic peoples, but for settled communities, they represented a revolutionary advancement in food storage and preparation. Early Nile Valley potters developed distinctive styles that reflected both the local availability of riverbank clay and the specific functional needs of agricultural communities. Religious and spiritual practices evolved alongside these material changes, as the seasonal cycle of planting, growing, and harvest became infused with sacred meaning. The river's annual flood transformed from a natural phenomenon to be predicted and prepared for into a divine gift requiring proper reverence and ritual observance. Shrines appeared at the edges of settlements, simple structures where communities could offer thanks for successful harvests and petition for favorable floods in seasons to come. The accumulation of material goods that permanent settlement allowed gradually differentiated families and individuals within communities in ways that nomadic life had never permitted. Those with particularly fertile plots, superior storage facilities, or exceptional skill in crop cultivation began to accumulate surplus that could be traded for goods produced by other settlements along the river. This emerging economic differentiation laid the groundwork for increasingly complex social hierarchies that would eventually culminate in the pharaonic civilization that would dominate the Nile Valley for millennia. Trade networks developed along the river as different settlements specialized in particular crafts or crops, creating the first regular commercial relationships between communities. Boats fashioned from papyrus reeds became the arteries of this early commerce, carrying pottery, grain, dried fish, and woven goods between settlements scattered along hundreds of miles of riverbank. These trading relationships strengthened the bonds between communities, while simultaneously encouraging each settlement to develop distinctive specializations and skills. As these farming communities took root along the riverbanks, their daily rhythms synchronized with the eternal pulse of the Nile, two distinctly different worlds began to emerge from the fertile mud and golden sands. The river that had drawn scattered tribes into permanence now served as both highway and boundary, nurturing the birth of two remarkable civilizations that would flourish in parallel for centuries before their eventual union would create one of history's most enduring empires. In the north, where the great river finally surrendered its precious waters to the Mediterranean Sea, the land spread wide and flat like an enormous green fan. This was the delta, Ta Mehu in the ancient tongue, meaning the land of the papyrus, where countless channels and tributaries wove through marshlands thick with reeds that rustled in the coastal winds. Here, Lower Egypt emerged as a civilization shaped by abundance and accessibility. The delta's geography created natural wealth beyond the dreams of the upstream communities, as multiple waterways provided not just irrigation but also transportation networks that connected distant villages and allowed for the easy movement of goods, ideas, and people. The people of Lower Egypt developed traditions rooted in this watery abundance. Their settlements clustered around the major channels, and their boats became works of art as much as utility, crafted from the papyrus that grew in seemingly endless profusion throughout the marshlands. These vessels, with their distinctive curved prows and flexible hulls, could navigate the shallowest waters and carry everything from grain to pottery to precious stones, gathered from trading expeditions that reached far into the Mediterranean world. The sound of water lapping against these boats became the constant soundtrack of delta life, mixing with the calls of ibises and herons that made their homes among the reeds. In the religious traditions of Lower Egypt, water held sacred significance that went far beyond its practical value. The cobra goddess Wadjet became their patron deity, her hood spread wide in protection over the papyrus marshes, while the god Hapi was honored as the personification of the Nile's flood itself. Their temples often featured pools and channels that brought the sacred river directly into the heart of their worship spaces, creating sanctuaries where the gentle sound of flowing water enhanced prayers and rituals that celebrated the generous spirits of flood and fertility. The craftspeople of Lower Egypt developed distinctive artistic styles that reflected their watery world. Their pottery featured flowing, curved lines that echoed the meandering channels of the delta, often decorated with images of fish, birds, and aquatic plants, rendered in blues and greens that captured the colors of their riverine paradise. Their jewelry incorporated shells and pearls gathered from the Mediterranean shores, creating ornaments that caught and reflected light, like sunbeams dancing on water. Even their architecture embraced curves and organic shapes, with buildings that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape rather than imposing geometric order upon it. Far to the south, beyond the cataracts, where granite outcroppings forced the river through narrow channels in tumbling displays of white water and spray, Upper Egypt developed along entirely different lines. This was Tashemau, the land of the sedge, where the river valley carved a narrow green ribbon through golden sandstone cliffs and endless expanses of desert that stretched to the horizons. Here, the Nile's gift of fertility was more precious because it was more limited, concentrated in a band of black earth that rarely extended more than a few miles from either bank before giving way to the eternal sands. The geography of Upper Egypt created a civilization of focused intensity, and vertical aspirations. With limited horizontal space for expansion, communities developed upward and inward, creating settlements that rose in terraces from the riverbank toward the desert cliffs. The constraining influence of the surrounding desert fostered a culture that valued precision, order, and the careful management of resources. Every drop of water was precious, every grain of wheat carefully counted and stored, every tool maintained with meticulous care that would ensure its longest possible service. In this environment of controlled abundance, the people of Upper Egypt developed traditions centered on permanence and power. Their boats were built for strength rather than flexibility, crafted from imported cedar wood that could withstand the rougher waters near the cataracts and carry heavy loads of stone quarried from the desert cliffs. These vessels moved with purpose and authority, their sturdy construction reflecting the character of the people who built them. The sound that defined Upper Egyptian life was not the gentle lapping of delta waters, but the rhythmic chanting of work gangs hauling massive stones from quarry to construction site, their voices echoing off the valley walls in harmony with the eternal song of human labor. The religious traditions of Upper Egypt reflected their more challenging environment through worship of deities associated with strength, protection, and the triumph of order over chaos. The vulture goddess Nekhbet spread her wings over the valley, while the god Set, lord of the desert and storms, commanded both fear and respect. Their temples were built to last forever, carved directly into cliff faces or constructed from enormous stone blocks that would withstand the desert winds and the occasional violent floods that could transform the peaceful Nile into a raging torrent of destruction. Upper Egyptian artisans developed an aesthetic philosophy based on monumentality and permanence. Their pottery was sturdy and practical, designed to last for generations of daily use, often decorated with geometric patterns that reflected the orderly arrangement of irrigated fields and the regular rhythm of seasonal flooding. Their jewelry featured gold mined from the desert mountains, crafted into bold, angular designs that proclaimed the wearer's status and power. Most distinctive of all, their sculptors began working in stone, creating statues and reliefs that captured the human form with increasing skill and sophistication, each work intended to endure long after its subject had returned to the earth. The contrasts between these two emerging civilizations extended into every aspect of daily life. In Lower Egypt, meals featured the abundant fish of the delta waters, prepared with herbs and vegetables that grew easily in the marshy soil, while bread made from wheat was supplemented with the protein-rich seeds of marsh plants. The diet was varied and plentiful, allowing for a more relaxed approach to food storage and distribution. Social gatherings often took place on boats or floating platforms, where the gentle motion of the water created a natural rhythm for conversation, music, and storytelling. Upper Egypt developed a more structured approach to sustenance, with communal granaries that stored the precious wheat harvest against times of low flood or crop failure. Meals were more formal affairs, eaten in family compounds where multiple generations gathered to share not just food, but also the wisdom and traditions that bound the community together across time. The protein in their diet came largely from cattle and goats that grazed on the stubble of harvested fields, while wild game from the desert margins provided variety for special occasions and religious festivals. The seasonal festivals of the two regions reflected these different relationships with abundance and scarcity. Lower Egypt celebrated with water processions, where decorated boats carried sacred images through the canal networks, while crowds gathered on the banks to sing and throw flowers into the sacred waters. These celebrations lasted for days, with the abundance of the delta supporting extended periods of communal feasting and artistic performance. Upper Egypt marked its festivals with processions that moved from the fertile valley floor up into the desert margins, symbolically connecting the world of human cultivation with the eternal realm of the gods. These celebrations were more intense but shorter, concentrating powerful spiritual energy into carefully orchestrated rituals that affirmed the community's connection to the divine forces that controlled their survival. As centuries passed, these two distinct cultures continued to evolve along their separate paths. each developing increasing sophistication in art, architecture, religious practice, and social organization. Yet the river that separated them also connected them, and traders, priests, and adventurers regularly traveled between the two regions, carrying goods, ideas, and stories that would eventually weave the two civilizations into a single, magnificent tapestry that would define ancient Egypt for over 3,000 years. As these distinct cultures flourished along the river's banks, something profound began to stir within the consciousness of the early Egyptian peoples. The daily rhythm of life along the Nile had awakened not merely an understanding of agriculture and settlement, but a deeper recognition of forces that seemed to transcend the physical world. The river that sustained them was becoming more than water and silt. It was transforming into something sacred, something worthy of reverence and awe. The first stirrings of this spiritual awakening emerged during the quiet hours before dawn, when the mists rose from the water's surface like ethereal spirits ascending toward the heavens. Farmers walking to their fields in the pale pre-dawn light would pause at the riverbank, watching as the sun's first rays struck the water and transformed it into liquid gold. In these moments of profound beauty, they began to sense that they were witnessing something divine, the daily rebirth of light and life itself, orchestrated by forces far greater than human understanding. The annual flood became the cornerstone of this developing spirituality, for it demonstrated with undeniable clarity the presence of divine power in their world. As the waters rose each year with perfect timing, bringing life to parched fields and renewal to the entire land, the early Egyptians recognized that this could not be mere chance or natural phenomenon. The flood was too perfectly timed, too absolutely essential, too mysteriously powerful to be anything other than the work of divine beings who watched over the river valley and its people. In the southern reaches of what would become Upper Egypt, communities began to develop elaborate ceremonies surrounding the flood's arrival. Elders would gather at sacred spots along the riverbank, places where the water seemed to flow with particular grace, or where unusual rock formations created natural shrines. These gatherings began as simple acknowledgements of gratitude, offerings of the first fruits and grains to the river that had made their cultivation possible. Women would weave garlands of marsh flowers and cast them upon the waters, watching as the current carried these gifts downstream toward unknown destinations. The reverence deepened as generations passed, each flood season reinforcing the understanding that the Nile possessed consciousness and will. When the floods came early, bringing abundance and prosperity, communities celebrated with feasts and dancing that lasted for days. When the floods were delayed or insufficient, bringing hardship and hunger, the people would gather in solemn vigil, offering prayers and sacrifices to appease whatever divine forces controlled the river's flow. These experiences taught them that the Nile was not merely beneficial, but also demanding, requiring proper respect and devotion. The river's divine nature became even more apparent through its physical characteristics, which seemed designed by supernatural intelligence. The Nile flowed from south to north, opposite to the direction of the prevailing winds, creating a natural highway where boats could sail upstream with the wind and drift downstream with the current. This remarkable convenience suggested divine planning, as if the gods had specifically designed the river system to serve human needs. The fertile black soil deposited by the floods created a stark contrast with the red desert sands on either side, marking clear boundaries between the realm of life and the realm of death. As communities developed more sophisticated understanding of the river's patterns, they began to perceive personality and emotion in its behavior. The floodwaters that arrived with gentle, steady rise were seen as expressions of divine contentment and blessing. The occasional violent floods that came with destructive force were interpreted as divine anger or displeasure, requiring careful examination of community behavior and appropriate ritual responses. The rare years when floods failed to materialize became periods of intense spiritual crisis, demanding extraordinary measures to restore harmony between the human and divine worlds. Different regions along the river developed distinct approaches to honoring the Nile's divine nature, creating a rich tapestry of early religious practices. In the Delta region, where the river spread into multiple channels before reaching the sea, communities focused on the mysteries of water's ultimate destination and return. They developed rituals involving the casting of sacred objects into the water, believing these offerings would travel to the realm of the gods and carry their prayers and petitions. The sight of the sun setting over the western desert from the delta's marshy islands inspired ceremonies celebrating the daily journey of divine light across the sky and its connection to the river's eternal flow. Upper Egyptian communities, living closer to the river's source regions, developed different but complementary spiritual practices. They focused more intensely on the flood's origins, creating elaborate mythologies about divine beings who controlled the river's source from hidden caverns deep in the southern mountains. Rock art from this period shows figures making offerings to stylized representations of the river, depicted as a flowing serpent or as a human figure pouring water from sacred vessels. These early artistic expressions reveal sophisticated theological thinking about the river's divine nature and the proper human response to its power. The development of early Egyptian spirituality was profoundly influenced by the river's role in cycles of death and renewal. Communities noticed that vegetation died completely during the dry season, only to burst forth with new life when the floodwaters arrived. This natural cycle of death and rebirth became central to emerging religious beliefs, with the Nile serving as the divine agent that made resurrection possible. Bodies of the deceased were often placed in reed boats and released into the current, symbolizing their journey to the afterlife realm, where they would join the divine forces that controlled the river's flow. Seasonal festivals began to mark the river's annual cycle, creating the foundation for what would eventually become elaborate state religious ceremonies. The arrival of the flood was celebrated with the Festival of the Rising Waters, featuring processions along the riverbank, ritual cleansing in the sacred waters, and community feasts emphasizing gratitude and renewal. The peak flood period was marked by the Festival of Abundance, celebrating the river's generous gift of fertility and life. The flood's recession was observed through the Festival of the Emerging Land, honoring the moment when new soil appeared and planting could begin. These early spiritual practices created profound unity between human communities and their natural environment. The river was not seen as separate from human life, but as an integral part of a cosmic order that included both mortal and divine elements. Daily activities became infused with spiritual significance, drawing water from the river, planting seeds in flood-deposited soil, fishing in the sacred waters, traveling by boat along the divine current. Every interaction with the river carried potential for communion with divine forces, transforming ordinary survival activities into acts of worship and devotion. The Nile's spiritual significance extended beyond practical considerations to encompass cosmic understanding. Early astronomers noticed connections between the river's flood cycle and celestial movements, particularly the annual rising of certain bright stars that coincided with flood season's approach. These observations reinforced beliefs about divine coordination between earthly and heavenly realms, suggesting that the same supernatural forces controlling the river also governed the movement of stars and planets across the night sky. Through this developing spirituality, the early Egyptian peoples were laying the foundation for one of history's most sophisticated and enduring religious traditions. Their reverence for the Nile as a divine force would eventually evolve into complex theological systems featuring elaborate pantheons of gods and goddesses, magnificent temples, and intricate mythologies explaining the relationship between human and divine worlds. But it all began with simple recognition of the river's sacred nature and grateful acknowledgement of its life-giving power, growing naturally from daily experience of its miraculous gifts and awesome authority. The sacred waters that had awakened humanity's first stirrings of divine consciousness now began to witness the emergence of earthly power structures that would echo through millennia. As communities along the Nile's fertile banks grew more prosperous and complex, the natural ebb and flow of human ambition began to assert itself alongside the river's ancient rhythms. The abundance that the great river provided had created not just surplus grain and thriving settlements, but also the luxury of time itself. Time for some individuals to step away from the daily labours of farming and fishing. Time to contemplate leadership. Time to dream of dominion over more than just their immediate patch of black earth. In these early centuries of the fourth millennium before the Common Era, the flat expanses of the Nile Delta and the narrow ribbon of cultivatable land stretching southward into Upper Egypt began to see the rise of figures whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of single villages. These were the proto-chiefs, men whose combination of charisma, strategic thinking, and perhaps a touch of ruthless ambition allowed them to unite previously independent communities under their authority. The process was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, like the slow accumulation of silt that builds new land along the riverbank over countless flooding seasons. The emergence of these early leaders was intimately connected to the river's life-giving properties and the increasingly sophisticated understanding of its patterns that certain individuals possessed. Those who could predict the flood's arrival with greater accuracy, who understood the subtle signs that preceded the inundation, who could organize the complex logistics of irrigation and grain storage, naturally found themselves sought out by their neighbors for guidance and protection. Knowledge, in these early times, was the foundation upon which temporal power was built, and knowledge of the Nile's mysteries was the most valuable currency of all. Along the verdant expanses of the delta, where the great river fractured into countless smaller channels before surrendering its waters to the Mediterranean, communities that had once operated as loose confederations of fishing villages began to coalesce around particularly influential leaders. The abundance of fish, waterfowl, and papyrus in this marshy paradise had created wealth that needed protection and management. Chiefs who could successfully coordinate the harvesting of these resources, who could negotiate with neighboring settlements over fishing rights and trade routes, found their authority expanding like ripples, spreading across still water. These delta chieftains built their power bases on foundations of practical necessity and spiritual authority. They were often the keepers of the most ancient traditions, the ones who could recite the proper prayers to ensure the flood's return, who knew the ritual observances that kept the river gods benevolent. Their residences, while modest by later pharaonic standards, began to take on characteristics that would become hallmarks of Egyptian royal architecture. Raised platforms that lifted them symbolically above the common people, courtyards that could accommodate gatherings of supporters and supplicants, and private chambers where the mysteries of leadership could be contemplated away from public scrutiny. Further south, in the narrow confines of Upper Egypt, where the river carved its path between cliffs of limestone and sandstone, a different type of authority began to emerge. Here, the challenges of desert survival and the more precarious nature of agriculture in the narrower floodplain created chiefs whose power rested as much on military prowess as on religious knowledge. These Upper Egyptian proto-kings learned to project their influence both northward down the river and southward toward the exotic lands of Nubia, where gold and ivory beckoned to those bold enough to organize expeditions into territories both dangerous and profitable. The consolidation of these early chieftaincies was not merely a matter of political maneuvering. It represented a fundamental transformation in how human societies related to their environment and to each other. Where once the rhythm of life had been dictated purely by the agricultural calendar and the river's moods, now there were human intermediaries who claimed the right to interpret divine will and organize collective action. These emerging leaders established the first crude but effective administrative systems, assigning responsibilities for different aspects of community life to trusted lieutenants, and creating the earliest forms of what would eventually become the elaborate bureaucracy of pharaonic Egypt. The proto-kingdoms that began to take shape during this period were remarkable for their synthesis of practical governance and spiritual authority. Chiefs maintained their legitimacy not simply through force or inherited privilege, but through their perceived connection to the divine forces that governed the Nile's behavior. They were expected to ensure not just the physical prosperity of their domains, but also the spiritual well-being of their people, interceding with the gods on behalf of their subjects and maintaining the cosmic order that kept the floods coming and the land fertile. Trade networks that had previously operated on an informal, village-to-village basis began to be organized and controlled by these emerging authorities. Chiefs who could guarantee safe passage for merchants traveling between Upper and Lower Egypt, who could provide standardized weights and measures for transactions, who could offer protection against bandits and river pirates, found themselves at the centers of increasingly prosperous commercial enterprises. The wealth generated by this controlled trade allowed them to support larger retinues of followers, to commission more elaborate burial monuments, and to extend their influence over ever wider territories. The physical manifestations of these early kingdoms were subtle but significant. Chiefs began to construct more permanent residences, often positioned strategically to overlook important river crossings or fertile agricultural areas. These proto-palaces served multiple functions: administrative centers where disputes could be resolved and tribute collected, religious sanctuaries where the proper rituals could be observed, and symbols of authority that reminded all who saw them of their ruler's elevated status. The architectural styles that emerged during this period would influence Egyptian building practices for thousands of years, emphasizing horizontal lines that echoed the flat expanse of the floodplain and massive walls that suggested both permanence and divine protection. The social hierarchies that developed within these proto-kingdoms reflected the complex interplay between practical necessity and emerging concepts of divinely ordained authority. Beneath the chiefs themselves, a class of administrators and specialists began to emerge. Scribes who could keep records of tribute and trade, craftsmen who could create the symbols and regalia of power, priests who could maintain the increasingly elaborate religious observances that legitimized royal authority. These early elites distinguished themselves through their dress, their diet, and their burial practices, creating visible markers of social stratification that would become deeply embedded in Egyptian culture. As these proto-kingdoms grew in size and sophistication, the inevitable tensions between neighboring chieftains began to manifest themselves in both diplomatic maneuvering and occasional armed conflict. The control of particularly fertile stretches of farmland, the rights to lucrative trade routes, the collection of tribute from smaller settlements, all of these became sources of competition that would drive the next phase of political evolution along the Nile. The stage was being set for the great unification that would create the world's first recognizable nation-state, as ambitious rulers began to envision domains that would stretch the entire length of the life-giving river. The legacy of these early chieftains extended far beyond their immediate political achievements, for they established patterns of leadership and governance that would endure throughout the long sweep of Egyptian history. Their synthesis of practical administration with spiritual authority, their creation of the first proto-bureaucracies, and their establishment of the principle that legitimate rule required divine sanction would all become fundamental characteristics of pharaonic civilization, echoing down through the centuries like the eternal rhythm of the Nile's life-giving floods. As these proto-kingdoms flourished along the life-giving waters of the Nile, the stage was set for one of history's most pivotal moments. The scattered chieftains, each ruling their modest territories with growing confidence, began to cast their eyes beyond their immediate borders. Trade routes carried not only goods, but whispered tales of distant settlements, of other leaders who commanded respect and tribute from their people. The river that had nurtured these early communities would soon become the conduit for their greatest transformation. In the pre-dynastic twilight of the 4th millennium before the Common Era, two distinct cultural and political entities had crystallized along the Nile's fertile banks. Upper Egypt, stretching from the first cataract at Aswan down to the area around modern-day Cairo, had developed its own distinctive identity. Here, the river flowed through a narrow valley carved deep into sandstone cliffs, creating a ribbon of green that stood in stark contrast to the golden desert beyond. The people of this southern realm wore the white crown, a tall, conical headdress that symbolized their dominion over the land of the lotus. Their patron goddess was Nekbet, the vulture deity who soared high above the cliffs, her wings spread in eternal protection over her chosen people. Meanwhile, the northern delta region had evolved into Lower Egypt, a vast expanse of marshlands and tributaries where the Nile spread its waters across countless channels before surrendering to the Mediterranean Sea. This was a land of papyrus thickets and abundant waterfowl, where fishing communities had grown into prosperous settlements. The red crown adorned the heads of Lower Egypt's rulers, its distinctive curved projection symbolizing the cobra goddess Wadjet, protector of the delta's emerald marshes. The cultural differences between these two realms were profound, yet both were children of the same great river that had shaped their destinies. Archaeological evidence whispers of increasing contact between these northern and southern kingdoms as the centuries progressed. Pottery styles began to show subtle influences crossing territorial boundaries. Ivory plaques carved with hieroglyphic symbols reveal the growing sophistication of record-keeping and the need to document exchanges between distant communities. The discovery of ceremonial mace heads and pallet fragments suggests that warfare, too, played its role in this ancient drama, though the full extent of conflicts remains shrouded in the mists of prehistory. From this complex political landscape emerged a figure whose name would echo through the millennia, though the historical details of his existence remain tantalizingly elusive. Narmer, whose name can be interpreted as the catfish who strikes, appears in the archaeological record as the great unifier, the king who would forge these disparate realms into a single, mighty civilization. The famous Narmer palette, discovered in the ancient temple at Hierakonpolis, provides the most vivid glimpse into this momentous transformation. Carved in schist and standing over 2 feet tall, this ceremonial artifact depicts scenes that archaeologists believe commemorate the conquest and unification of the two lands. On one side of the palette, Narmer appears wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, his powerful arm raised to strike a kneeling captive with a ceremonial mace. The scene pulses with symbolic meaning. The falcon god Horus perches nearby, holding a rope that leads to a human head emerging from papyrus plants, representing the capture of the delta region. On the reverse side, the king processes wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, surveying rows of decapitated enemies whose severed heads rest between their feet. The imagery is stark and uncompromising, yet it speaks to a moment when the ancient world's greatest civilization was born from conquest and consolidation. The unification under Narmer was far more than a mere military conquest. It represented the fusion of 2 distinct cultural traditions into something entirely new and unprecedented. The combined crown, showing both the white crown of the south nested within the red crown of the north, became the ultimate symbol of pharaonic power. This double crown, known as the Shent, would adorn the heads of Egypt's rulers for over 3,000 years, a constant reminder of the foundational moment when 2 lands became one under divine kingship. With unification came the establishment of Memphis, strategically positioned at the junction between Upper and Lower Egypt. This new capital city rose from the Nile's west bank, its white walls gleaming in the desert sun as a testament to the unified kingdom's power and permanence. The choice of location was masterful, allowing the new pharaoh to maintain control over both regions while serving as a symbolic bridge between the 2 ancient realms. Memphis would grow to become one of the ancient world's greatest cities, its monuments and temples reflecting the wealth and ambition of the unified state. The birth of the First Dynasty marked the beginning of pharaonic civilization as the world would come to know it. Narmer's successors, including the shadowy figure known as Aha, who may have been the pharaoh later called Menez by Greek historians, consolidated the unified kingdom's institutions and expanded its influence. The concept of divine kingship, where the pharaoh served as the living embodiment of the falcon god Horus, became the cornerstone of Egyptian political and religious life. This revolutionary idea, that a mortal ruler could channel the power and authority of the gods themselves, would influence civilizations throughout the ancient world. The establishment of the unified kingdom brought with it unprecedented organizational capabilities. The need to govern territories stretching nearly 700 miles along the Nile demanded sophisticated administrative systems. Hieroglyphic writing, which had begun to emerge in the pre-dynastic period, flourished under the early dynasties as scribes documented everything from tax collections to royal decrees. The irrigation systems that had served individual communities were expanded and coordinated on a massive scale, turning the entire Nile Valley into a carefully managed agricultural powerhouse. Trade networks expanded dramatically as the unified kingdom's influence spread throughout the region. Egyptian expeditions ventured into Nubia seeking gold and exotic goods, while Mediterranean contacts brought new materials and ideas into the kingdom. The wealth generated by these expanding commercial relationships funded increasingly ambitious construction projects and supported a growing class of skilled artisans and craftsmen. The artistic achievements of the early dynastic period reflect this newfound confidence and prosperity. Tomb paintings begin to show the characteristic Egyptian artistic conventions that would endure for millennia, while sculpture achieves new levels of sophistication and symbolic complexity. The royal tombs at Abydos and Saqqara reveal the elaborate burial practices that would culminate in the Great Pyramids of the Old Kingdom, demonstrating the early pharaohs' determination to ensure their eternal survival in the afterlife. Religious practices underwent profound changes as the unified kingdom developed its distinctive theological systems. The merger of Upper and Lower Egyptian deities created a rich and complex pantheon, while the concept of Maat, representing truth, justice, and cosmic order, became central to Egyptian worldview. The pharaoh's role as the earthly guarantor of Maat justified his absolute authority, while establishing moral and ethical expectations for his rule. The Nile itself remained the beating heart of this remarkable civilization, its annual flood continuing to dictate the rhythm of Egyptian life. The unified kingdom's ability to harness the river's power on an unprecedented scale created agricultural surpluses that supported increasingly complex social hierarchies. Farmers, artisans, scribes, priests, and nobles all found their places in a carefully ordered society that prized stability and continuity above all else. As the first dynasty consolidated its power, the foundations were laid for 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. The unification under Narmer had created more than just a political entity. It had given birth to a civilization that would achieve immortality through its monuments, its wisdom, and its enduring fascination with the eternal mysteries of life and death. The gift of the Nile had been transformed into something magnificent and enduring, a testament to human ambition guided by divine inspiration. Where the great river bends toward the Mediterranean, where the fertile delta spreads its green fingers into countless channels, there arose a city that would become the beating heart of pharaonic civilization. Memphis emerged from the mudflats and papyrus marshes not merely as another settlement along the Nile's banks, but as the embodiment of a revolutionary idea that divine kingship could manifest itself in stone, in ceremony, and in the eternal rhythms of a civilization that would endure for 3 millennia. The very ground upon which Memphis was built seemed chosen by the gods themselves, positioned at the precise point where Upper and Lower Egypt converged, where the narrow valley opened into the sprawling delta, creating a natural capital for a newly unified land. The city's founding marked more than the establishment of administrative headquarters for Narmer's expanding kingdom. Here, in this marshy confluence of waters and worlds, the ancient Egyptians began to crystallize the complex web of beliefs, practices, and institutions that would define their civilization. The name itself carried profound meaning. Men-Nefer, meaning enduring and beautiful, spoke to aspirations that reached far beyond the practical needs of governance into the realm of cosmic permanence. The scribes who first carved these hieroglyphs into stone tablets understood that they were documenting not just the birth of a city, but the materialization of Maat, the divine order that governed both earthly and celestial realms. Archaeological evidence suggests that Memphis began as a fortress, Ineb Hedge, the White Walls, rising from artificially raised ground that protected it from the annual floods, while keeping it accessible to the Nile's life-giving waters. The massive earthworks required to create this elevated platform speak to an unprecedented mobilization of human resources, thousands upon thousands of workers hauling baskets of mud and stone to build the foundation upon which pharaonic power would rest. The engineering achievement represented something entirely new in the ancient world. Not merely a fortification or trading post, but a purpose-built capital designed to project royal authority across vast distances while serving as a conduit between the earthly realm of human subjects and the divine sphere of eternal gods. Within these white walls, the first pharaohs established the administrative apparatus that would govern Egypt for centuries. Scribes trained in the emerging hieroglyphic system worked in chambers filled with papyrus scrolls, recording tribute from distant provinces, tracking the rise and fall of the Nile, maintaining the complex calendars that governed religious festivals and agricultural cycles. The sound of reed pens scratching against papyrus became the steady percussion underlying Egypt's transformation from a collection of tribal territories into a centralized state capable of organizing massive construction projects and maintaining trade relationships stretching from Nubia to the Levant. These administrative innovations, born in the halls of Memphis, created the bureaucratic foundation that would support pyramid construction, military campaigns, and the elaborate religious ceremonies that reinforced pharaonic legitimacy. The spiritual significance of Memphis extended far beyond its political importance, establishing patterns of religious architecture and ceremony that would echo through Egyptian civilization. The great temple of Ptah, the creator god who spoke the world into existence through divine speech, rose on the city's most sacred ground, its limestone columns carved with hieroglyphs that transformed architectural space into religious text. Here, the high priests developed the theological framework that positioned the pharaoh as the living embodiment of divine will, the sole intermediary between the realm of gods and the world of mortals. The rituals performed within these sacred precincts, the daily awakening of the god's statue, the presentation of offerings, the chanting of ancient formulas, created a rhythm of worship that synchronized earthly time with cosmic cycles. The royal necropolis at nearby Saqqara emerged as Memphis grew, its mastaba tombs and eventually the step pyramid of Djoser, representing humanity's first attempts to build eternity in stone. The relationship between the living city and the eternal resting places of the dead established a fundamental principle of Egyptian civilization, that death was not an ending, but a transformation, that proper preparation and ritual could ensure the continuation of life beyond the physical realm. The skilled craftsmen who carved reliefs in these tombs, depicting scenes of daily life alongside religious imagery, were creating more than decoration. They were encoding the essential knowledge that would allow the deceased to navigate the afterlife successfully. The economic foundations laid in Memphis transformed Egypt from a primarily agricultural society into a complex civilization capable of supporting specialized crafts, long-distance trade, and monumental construction. The city's workshops produced goods that would be traded throughout the ancient Mediterranean: fine textiles woven from flax grown in the delta, jewelry crafted from gold mined in the eastern desert, furniture inlaid with ivory carried north from Nubia. The harbour districts bustled with activity as boats arrived carrying cedar wood from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that enriched Egyptian culture while spreading Egyptian influence throughout the known world. The social structures that emerged in Memphis established patterns that would characterize Egyptian society for millennia. The royal court developed elaborate protocols that defined relationships between the pharaoh and various levels of officials, from the highest viziers to local administrators responsible for individual provinces. The concept of ma'at influenced every aspect of social organization, creating expectations of justice, order, and proper behavior that permeated Egyptian society from the palace to the humblest village. The sophisticated legal system that developed in Memphis, with its emphasis on written contracts and formal procedures, provided stability and predictability that encouraged economic growth and cultural development. The artistic innovations that flourished in Memphis during these formative centuries established aesthetic principles that would define Egyptian art for thousands of years. The canonical proportions used in depicting the human figure, the conventions for representing gods and pharaohs, the integration of hieroglyphic text with visual imagery, all emerged from the workshops and scriptoriums of the early capital. Master craftsmen trained apprentices in techniques that balanced naturalistic observation with symbolic meaning, creating an artistic language capable of communicating complex religious and political concepts across centuries of cultural continuity. The distinctive Egyptian style, recognizable immediately even to modern viewers, was born in these Memphis workshops, where artists first learned to transform religious and royal iconography into enduring visual forms. As Memphis matured from fortress to capital to sacred city, it became the laboratory where Egyptian civilization experimented with the fundamental questions that would occupy its thinkers for millennia: the nature of divine kingship, the relationship between order and chaos, the possibility of achieving immortality through proper ritual and moral behavior. The philosophical frameworks developed here provided intellectual foundations for a civilization that would demonstrate remarkable stability and continuity. The concept of cyclical time, mirroring the annual Nile flood and the daily journey of the sun god across the sky, emerged from Memphite religious thought and would influence Egyptian approaches to history, politics, and personal destiny throughout the pharaonic period. The legacy of Memphis extended far beyond its role as Egypt's first capital, establishing precedents and institutions that would survive the rise and fall of dynasties, the construction of new capitals, and the eventual conquest by foreign powers. The administrative systems pioneered here would be adapted by successive kingdoms. The religious concepts developed in its temples would influence spiritual traditions throughout the Mediterranean world, and the artistic styles created in its workshops would inspire imitation and admiration across cultures and centuries. In founding Memphis, the early pharaohs created not just a city, but a template for civilization itself, demonstrating how human organization, divine inspiration, and natural abundance could combine to create something approaching earthly permanence in a world of constant change. Memphis stood as the beating heart of this new civilization, its mud brick palaces and administrative buildings rising from the fertile delta like manifestations of divine will. From this strategic center, the early pharaohs cast their influence across the length of the Nile, binding together the disparate peoples of Egypt under a single, unifying vision. The city hummed with activity as scribes bent over papyrus scrolls, their reed pens scratching out the earliest written records of royal decrees and administrative orders. Stonemasons worked tirelessly in nearby quarries, their bronze tools ringing against limestone and granite, preparing the materials that would transform the Egyptian landscape forever. Within the royal workshops of Memphis, craftsmen perfected techniques that had been emerging since the pre-dynastic period, their skilled hands shaping precious metals, carving intricate reliefs, and weaving textiles that would adorn the bodies and tombs of the divine kings. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of hammering, as goldsmiths created elaborate jewelry embedded with lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan and turquoise from the Sinai Peninsula. These artisans worked not merely as craftspeople, but as participants in a sacred endeavor, their creations destined to accompany the pharaohs into the afterlife and proclaim their divine status to both mortal subjects and immortal gods. The flowering of early dynastic culture manifested most dramatically in the realm of written language, as the hieroglyphic system evolved from simple pictographs into a sophisticated means of recording not only practical information, but also religious texts, royal proclamations, and literary works. Scribes occupied positions of enormous prestige in this emerging society, their literacy marking them as intermediaries between the divine pharaoh and his mortal subjects. In the cool shadows of temple schools, young men learned to manipulate the complex symbols that could capture the essence of spoken words, transforming fleeting sounds into permanent marks upon stone and papyrus. The very act of writing became imbued with magical significance, each carefully formed hieroglyph carrying the power to make abstract concepts tangible and eternal. These early texts reveal a civilization already possessed of remarkable sophistication in matters of theology, law, and administration. royal annals recorded the deeds of pharaohs in measured prose that emphasized their role as earthly representatives of divine order, while administrative documents tracked the movement of goods throughout the kingdom with mathematical precision. Religious texts began to codify the complex mythology that would guide Egyptian spiritual life for millennia, describing the daily journey of Ra across the sky, the eternal struggle between order and chaos, and the intricate rituals required to maintain cosmic harmony. Each written word reinforced the fundamental belief that Egypt existed as a reflection of celestial perfection, an earthly mirror of divine truth. The monumental architecture that began to rise during this period represented perhaps the most visible expression of the new dynastic culture's ambitions and capabilities. The royal tombs at Abydos and Saqqara grew increasingly elaborate with each successive reign. Their subterranean chambers expanding into complex labyrinths designed to house not only the pharaoh's physical remains, but also the vast quantities of grave goods deemed necessary for his continued existence in the afterlife. Master builders experimented with new construction techniques, gradually replacing the mud brick mastabas of earlier periods with structures incorporating increasing amounts of dressed stone. The sound of stonemasons' chisels became a constant presence across the royal necropolises, their rhythmic work creating monuments that would endure long after the wooden boats and linen wrappings had crumbled to dust. At Saqqara, the genius of Imhotep, architect to the pharaoh Djoser, revolutionized Egyptian building practices by conceiving the first monumental stone structure in human history. The step pyramid rose in graduated tiers toward the heavens, its limestone blocks fitted together with unprecedented precision, creating a permanent dwelling place for the divine king's eternal spirit. The complex surrounding this magnificent tomb included temples, courtyards, and subsidiary buildings that replicated in stone the royal palace compounds of the living world, ensuring that Djoser's afterlife would mirror the splendor of his earthly reign. Workers hauled massive blocks from distant quarries, their efforts coordinated by administrators who understood logistics on a scale that dwarfed earlier construction projects. The artistic traditions that flourished during this formative period established aesthetic principles that would guide Egyptian culture for thousands of years. Palace walls bloomed with painted reliefs depicting the pharaoh in ritual poses. His figure rendered according to canonical proportions that emphasized his divine nature through idealized human form. Artists developed the distinctive Egyptian artistic vocabulary of profile heads combined with frontal torsos, creating images that captured not momentary appearances, but eternal essences. The royal workshops produced sculptures in hard stones like diorite and granite, their surfaces polished to mirror-like perfection that seemed to glow with inner light in the flickering illumination of oil lamps. Religious architecture evolved alongside royal building projects, as temple complexes grew in size and sophistication to accommodate the increasingly elaborate rituals of divine kingship. The daily ceremonies that maintained cosmic order required precisely constructed sacred spaces, their proportions determined by mathematical relationships that reflected the underlying harmony of creation itself. Columns began to appear in these early temples, their forms derived from the bundled papyrus stalks and lotus flowers that grew along the Nile's banks, transforming organic shapes into permanent stone expressions of the river's life-giving power. Priests moved through these sacred spaces in carefully choreographed processions, their movements as precisely regulated as the architectural forms that surrounded them. The royal court that developed around the pharaoh became increasingly elaborate during this period, with complex hierarchies of officials, priests, and administrators, each playing specialized roles in the maintenance of divine kingship. Noble families established themselves in magnificent tomb complexes near the royal burial grounds, their own monuments reflecting their status within the emerging aristocracy, while remaining carefully subordinated to the supreme majesty of the pharaoh. Courtiers dressed in fine linen garments, adorned with jewelry that proclaimed their rank, their daily lives governed by protocols that reinforced the sacred nature of royal authority through every gesture and word. Trade networks that had emerged during the unification period now flourished under centralized royal control, bringing exotic materials and foreign influences that enriched the developing culture while remaining filtered through distinctly Egyptian sensibilities. Merchants traveling to Nubia returned with gold, ebony, and ivory, while expeditions to the Levant brought back cedar wood and silver that would be incorporated into royal building projects and tomb furnishings. These foreign contacts stimulated artistic innovation while strengthening the Egyptian sense of cultural superiority, as craftsmen adapted foreign motifs and techniques to serve the needs of pharaonic ideology and religious practice. The culmination of this early dynastic flowering lay not in any single monument or text, but in the successful establishment of a civilization that would endure, with remarkable continuity, for over 3,000 years. The cultural foundations laid during these formative centuries proved so robust that they would survive foreign invasions, internal upheavals, and the rise and fall of numerous dynasties while maintaining their essential character. In the workshops of Memphis and the temples of Heliopolis, in the tombs of Saqqara and the administrative centers scattered throughout the kingdom, the patterns of Egyptian civilization took permanent form, creating a legacy that would inspire wonder and admiration until the end of time itself. The eternal rhythm of the Nile continues its ancient dance through the heart of Egypt, as it has for countless millennia, carrying within its waters the memory of civilizations that rose and flourished along its banks. This great river, which the Greeks called Nilos and the Egyptians knew as Iteru, flows through time itself, its seasonal pulse marking the passage of centuries with the same reliable cadence that once governed the lives of pharaohs and farmers alike. The waters that today reflect the modern skylines of Cairo and Aswan are the same waters that witnessed the construction of the Great Pyramid, the reign of Cleopatra, and the quiet daily rituals of countless generations who understood their lives to be inseparably bound to the river's generous spirit. In the pre-dawn darkness of contemporary Egypt, the Nile still carries the ancient whispers of flood season, though the Great Aswan High Dam now regulates what nature once orchestrated through celestial mechanics and distant mountain rains. The feluccas that drift across its surface at twilight trace the same paths their ancestors carved through these waters 5,000 years ago, their white sails catching the last light of day in a scene that Pharaoh Khufu might recognize, despite the passage of nearly 50 centuries. The river's banks, though changed by modern agriculture and development, still pulse with the fundamental rhythm that made this narrow valley the cradle of one of humanity's most enduring civilizations. The genetic memory of the annual flood lives on in the very soil of the Nile Valley, where farmers still recognize the subtle gradations of fertility that speak to thousands of years of sedimentary gift-giving from the Ethiopian highlands. These layers of silt, compressed and enriched by time, form a vertical library of the river's generosity, each stratum telling the story of a particular flood season, a specific year when the Nile rose to precisely the right height to ensure abundance for the civilization that depended upon its precision. Modern agricultural techniques may have replaced the ancient basin irrigation systems, but the fundamental relationship between river and land, between water and life, remains as profound and necessary as it was when the first Egyptian farmers learned to read the river's moods and seasons. The temples that still stand along the Nile's banks serve as stone testimonies to the river's central role in Egyptian spiritual life, their walls covered with hieroglyphic hymns of praise to the life-giving waters that made their construction possible. At Edfu and Kom Ombo, at Luxor and Philae, the ancient stones seem to hum with recognition each time the river flows past, carrying within its current the same minerals and memories that nourished the hands that carved these eternal monuments to divine kingship and cosmic order. The crocodiles that once embodied the god Sobek may be fewer now, but the sacred ibises still wade through the shallows at dawn, their movements a living continuation of the hieroglyphic symbols that adorned temple walls dedicated to Thoth, the god of wisdom who measured the flood and recorded its sacred mathematics. Each sunset over the Nile recreates the ancient drama of Ra's journey through the underworld, the golden light spreading across waters that have reflected this same celestial theatre for geological ages. the river's surface becomes a mirror for eternity, capturing clouds and palm fronds, and the occasional flight of egrets, in compositions that echo the painted scenes found in tombs carved into the desert cliffs above the valley. These limestone chambers, where ancient Egyptians prepared for their own journey through the afterlife, overlook the river that they believed would carry their souls to judgment, and, if found worthy, to eternal life in the field of reeds, a paradisiacal version of the Nile Valley, where the flood came perfectly each year and the harvests never failed. The mathematics of the Nile's cycle, once calculated by priests who served as the kingdom's hydrologists and astronomers, continues to influence the rhythm of life in modern Egypt, though satellites and computer models have replaced the ancient Nilometers that measured the river's rise with ceremonial precision. The knowledge that flood season brought renewal, that the river's retreat revealed fresh planting opportunities, and that the harvest must be completed before the next inundation remains embedded in the agricultural consciousness of the valley, passed down through generations of farmers who may not know the names of the pharaohs, but still understand the eternal covenant between river and civilization that their ancestors discovered in the dawn of recorded history. The Nile's gift extends beyond agriculture into the realm of human consciousness itself, for this river taught humanity some of its first lessons about the relationship between natural cycles and divine order, about the necessity of cooperation in the face of environmental challenges, and about the possibility of creating lasting monuments to human achievement when a civilization learns to work in harmony with the natural forces that sustain it. The concept of Ma'at, that fundamental Egyptian principle of cosmic balance and social justice, emerged from observations of the river's reliable alternation between flood and recession, abundance and scarcity, the understanding that civilization thrives when it mirrors nature's own commitment to cyclical renewal and measured distribution of life's necessities. The papyrus that once grew in vast marshes along the Nile's delta continues to survive in small, carefully tended plots, its fibrous stems still capable of producing the writing material that allowed ancient Egypt to become one of history's first literate civilizations. The river that provided the water to soften these reeds, the mud to create the writing surface, and the transportation network to distribute the finished scrolls throughout the ancient world, thus enabled the preservation of Egyptian wisdom, poetry, and administrative records that continue to illuminate our understanding of humanity's earliest experiments with complex society and monumental architecture. As night falls over the Nile Valley, the stars emerge in patterns that ancient Egyptian astronomers used to predict the river's flood and to align their greatest architectural achievements with cosmic forces they believed governed earthly prosperity. The constellation they called Sopdet, which modern astronomy knows as Sirius, still rises before dawn in the same season when the ancient flood once began its journey from the Ethiopian highlands toward the Mediterranean Sea. This stellar clock, ticking away the millennia with the same reliability as the river's flow, connects contemporary observers with an unbroken chain of human consciousness that stretches back to the very beginnings of recorded time. When the first pharaohs learned to read the sky and river as complementary texts in the grand narrative of divine kingship and natural abundance. The legacy of the Nile flows forward through time like the river itself, carrying within its current the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that learned to see in seasonal flooding not disaster, but divine gift, not chaos, but cosmic order, made manifest in the practical terms of agricultural abundance and social prosperity. The great river continues its eternal journey toward the sea, bearing within its waters the memory of pyramids and temples, of pharaohs and farmers, of scribes and sculptors who understood their lives to be chapters in a story written by the river itself. A story that continues to unfold with each dawn that breaks over the life-giving waters that remain, as they have always been, the eternal heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. Flowing onward through the endless cycles of time, carrying the dreams of humanity toward an horizon that shimmers always just beyond the reach of mortal sight, eternal and ever-renewing, like the river itself.